What made you hate the person you married? My daughter Manon started gymnastics when she was 6, and by 8 she was flying. She had this natural grace that made other parents stop and stare during practice. When she won her first level 4 state championship, my husband David and I both cried in the stands. He grabbed my hand and whispered, "She's got what I never had." Pride swelled in my chest. David started coming to every single practice while I stayed home with our younger son. He'd film Manon's routines from different angles and make me watch them at dinner while Manon picked at her food. My appetite would disappear watching her push lettuce around. When Manon's local coach said she'd peaked at that level, David found an elite gymnastics academy 3 hours away. I protested about the drive and the cost, but David had already crunched the numbers. He'd take a second job and we'd make it work because Manon needs real coaching if she wants nationals. Dread settled in my stomach. The other parents at the new gym called him Coach Dad, and Manon would light up when they said it. I watched David learn every gymnastics term and start timing Manon's routines with a stopwatch. When I suggested maybe Manon could try other activities too, David would shake his head and say, "I didn't understand what we were building here." Resentment burned in my throat. David moved a pull-up bar into Manon's bedroom doorway and started making her do conditioning exercises every morning before school. I'd hear her grunting and counting repetitions while I made breakfast, and my stomach would twist. When I asked him to let her sleep in just once, he said, "Champions don't get to sleep in." Manon started getting hurt more often, and I'd find her soaking her feet in ice water after practice. But when I brought it up, David would pull out his phone and show me videos of Olympic gymnasts training through injuries. One night I found Manon crying in the bathroom because her shoulders hurt so bad she couldn't lift her arms above her head. She begged me not to tell David because he'd just add more conditioning exercises. That's when I realized I was scared of my own husband. Fear crawled up my spine. When Manon broke her wrist during vault practice, the doctor said 8 weeks in a cast, then 4 weeks of physical therapy before she could return to gymnastics. David nodded and smiled, but I watched his leg bounce the entire time. 2 weeks later, Manon came home from school wearing a removable wrist brace instead of her cast. David said he'd found a sports medicine specialist who understood elite athletics, but when I called our regular doctor, he said no legitimate physician would remove a cast that early. Rage flooded through me. David had already registered Manon for a competition happening that weekend. When I said we needed to withdraw her, he looked at me like I'd suggested giving up on Manon completely. Saturday morning, I told David that Manon needed to rest her wrist, and I was taking our son to soccer practice instead. David just nodded and said he'd stay home with Manon, and maybe they'd watch some competition videos. When I got back 3 hours later, the house was empty. My hands started shaking as I grabbed my keys and drove to the gymnastics meet across town. I found David's car in the parking lot and ran into the competition venue just as they announced Manon's name for floor exercise. She was standing at the corner of the mat in her sparkly red leotard, rotating her wrist in small circles. Even from the bleachers, I could see her face was white with fear. My heart hammered. David was in the front row with his video camera already recording. She threw her hands back and I watched her wrist buckle the moment it hit the floor. The crack echoed through the entire gym like a branch snapping. Manon's scream cut through every other sound as she crumpled to the mat, clutching her arm. I ran down from the bleachers while other parents gasped and covered their children's eyes. Manon was sobbing and her wrist was bent at an angle that made my stomach lurch. That's when I heard David behind me talking to another parent. Well, at least now she'll have a real comeback story to tell college recruiters. I turned around and stared at him. Pure hatred crystallized in that moment. Manon was being loaded onto a stretcher with a career-ending injury, and he was already planning her narrative. I packed our bags that night. Manon's gymnastics career ended with that surgery, and we divorced 6 months later. David remarried last year, and his new wife's daughter just started gymnastics. I saw them at a competition last month. He was filming her routine from the exact same spot he used to film Manon's. I left before the awards ceremony started.